In the quiet town of Ravenwood, where time seemed to flow more slowly than in other places, stood the imposing Blackwood Mansion, a Victorian structure that, even in its state of abandonment, maintained a strange dignity among the vegetation that tried to reclaim it. The older residents of the town avoided even looking in its direction when passing along the winding road that led to the property, and stories about the events that occurred there decades ago were whispered only in moments of alcoholic indiscretion at the local bar. For most adults, the mansion represented an obscure chapter of local history best left forgotten. For the teenagers of Ravenwood High School, however, it represented the perfect setting to prove courage and feed the social reputation they so valued at that stage of life. No one could have predicted that what would begin as a typical display of teenage rebellion, spending a night in the house everyone said was haunted, would transform into the most disturbing event ever recorded in the town's recent history, an occurrence that would leave permanent marks not only on the young people involved, but on the entire community. Jason Miller, Emily Chen, Mike Donovan, and Lily Thompson formed an unlikely group of friends, united more by circumstances than by common interests. Jason, the football team's quarterback and the local sheriff's son, carried with him the unshakable confidence of someone who always had the world at his feet. Emily, with her impeccable academic record and scientific skepticism, already had a guaranteed spot at Ivy League universities. Mike compensated for his insecurity with a sharp sense of humor that frequently masked his true feelings. And Lily, quiet and introspective, was known for her strange claims about feeling things that others couldn't perceive, something most attributed to the fertile imagination of a girl who had lost her parents at a very young age. It was during a Friday night party, when teenage boredom met the typical recklessness of youth, that the challenge was issued. Who would have the courage to spend an entire night in Blackwood Mansion? What should have been just another story to tell in the school hallway the following Monday would end up becoming the catalyst for events that none of them could have imagined in their darkest nightmares. The history of the Blackwood family was shrouded in mystery and contradictions. The official version, recorded in the town archives and occasionally mentioned in sensationalist reports about America's most haunted houses, spoke of a tragic fire that had claimed the entire family during the night: Patriarch Charles Blackwood, his wife Eleanor, and their 3 children. However, the rumors that circulated among the elders told a different story. They spoke of screams heard for weeks before the tragedy, of strange lights seen in the attic windows at impossible hours, and of how the only body ever found was Charles's, in a state that made the local coroner refuse to describe it in detail. The mansion remained untouched since then, with endless inheritance disputes between distant relatives who never reached an agreement, as if no one really wanted to claim the property. As the 4 teenagers prepared for their night of adventure, none of them knew they were about to discover that the truth about Blackwood Mansion was infinitely more terrible than any urban legend could suggest, and that some doors, once opened, can never be completely closed again. Friday began like any other in the final semester at Ravenwood High School. Jason Miller parked his Cherokee Jeep, an inheritance from his 18th birthday, in the space reserved for him in the student parking lot, an unofficial privilege granted to the quarterback who had taken the team to the state finals for the first time in 15 years. As he walked through the hallways, he received the usual greetings and pats on the back. Teenage royalty in his small kingdom. It was during lunch, sitting at the central table in the cafeteria with Emily, Mike, and Lily, that the conversation about that night's party at Tyler Bennett's house took an unexpected turn. "I'm tired of the same parties, with the same people, doing the same things," Jason commented, absent-mindedly twisting the cap of his water bottle. "We need something different, something nobody else has the courage to do." It was at that moment that Tyler, passing by the table, casually mentioned the 50th anniversary of the Blackwood tragedy, which would be the following week. "My grandfather said the entire town went silent that day," he commented. "To this day, no one knows what really happened in there." The suggestion came from Mike, initially as a joke. "What if we spent the night there? We could throw our own anniversary anniversary party for the ghosts, but the gleam in Jason's eyes indicated that the idea had found fertile ground. Emily immediately protested, citing everything from trespassing on private property to the structural danger of a building abandoned for decades. Lily remained silent, her fingers nervously playing with the crystal pendant she always carried with her. "Come on, Em," Jason insisted, using the nickname he knew she secretly loved. "Where's your scientific spirit? Wouldn't it be the perfect opportunity to debunk all these ghost stories once and for all?" Mike, sensing Emily's hesitation diminishing, intensified. "Just imagine the Instagram photos. Brilliant scientist proves ghosts don't exist. Your Harvard application will practically accept itself." Only Lily maintained her opposition, her voice almost a whisper when she finally spoke. "Some doors shouldn't be opened. Some houses don't want visitors." Lily's words were quickly dismissed as just another example of her weirdness, and by the end of the day, the plan was established. They would meet at Tyler's party, but slip away discreetly around 11 p.m., driving to Blackwood Mansion with supplies for a full night, flashlights, sleeping bags, food, and a few bottles borrowed from Jason's parents' bar. The rules were simple. No one could leave the property until dawn, no matter how scared they got. "It's just an old house," Jason assured them as they separated after the last class. "The worst that can happen is we catch a cold from the dust." None of them noticed the somber expression on the face of Mr. Jenkins, the elderly school janitor, who was changing a light bulb nearby and had heard the entire conversation. When the teenagers were far away, he muttered to himself, "Poor foolish children. They have no idea what's waiting for them in there." The night arrived with a strange mist rarely seen in Ravenwood at that time of year. The party at Tyler's house was in full swing when the four friends met in the backyard to review their plan. Emily had extensively researched the mansion during the afternoon, sharing historical facts about its construction in 1887 and theories about the fire that supposedly killed the family. "It's interesting," she commented, showing images on her tablet. "There are no official records of bodies found, except for Charles Blackwood's, and even then the coroner's report is sealed to this day." Mike feigned an exaggerated shiver. "Ooh, mystery. Maybe they turned into ghosts because they didn't have a proper burial." Jason laughed, but Lily remained serious, her eyes fixed on the old photograph of the mansion in its original splendor. "They're not dead," she said suddenly, causing the other three to stare at her. "At least, not in the way we think about death." The path to Blackwood Mansion was rarely used, with low branches scratching the roof of the Jeep as Jason maneuvered around the potholes in the dirt road. The property was surrounded by an imposing wrought iron fence, but the main gate had been broken long ago, hanging precariously on a single hinge. When Jason parked about 100 meters from the house, turning off the headlights, the true magnitude of the mansion revealed itself under the moonlight, partially obscured by the mist. 3 floors of Victorian architecture rose against the night sky, with twin towers flanking the main structure and dozens of windows that seemed to watch them like empty eyes. "Wow," whispered Mike, his usual joking tone momentarily absent. "Looks like it came straight out of a horror movie." Emily checked her cell phone, frowning. "No signal here? We should tell someone where we are for safety." Jason dismissed the concern with a gesture. "Relax. I already texted Tyler telling him where we'd be. Besides, it's just one night. What could happen?" As they walked toward the main entrance, carrying their backpacks and flashlights, none of them noticed how the shadows around the property seemed to move against the wind, or how the air grew progressively colder with each step they took toward that ornate door which, to everyone's surprise, opened smoothly at Jason's touch, as if the house had been waiting for them. The interior of Blackwood Mansion revealed itself surprisingly intact, considering the decades of abandonment. The entrance hall, with its cracked marble floor and an imposing chandelier covered in cobwebs, still retained vestiges of its former elegance. Jason was the first to enter, his flashlight illuminating dusty portraits of stern-faced people who seemed to follow the visitors with their eyes. "Welcome to the haunted palace," he joked, his voice echoing more than expected in the vast space. Emily followed, immediately taking pictures with her cell phone and making notes in a small notebook she had brought specifically to document the experience. "The architecture is amazing," she commented, pointing to the elaborate carvings on the wooden columns. "This is genuine oak, probably imported from Europe." Mike entered next, whistling softly as he slowly turned, absorbing the environment. "Man, imagine how much a house like this would cost today. I bet the Blackwoods were filthy rich." Lily was the last across the threshold, visibly hesitating before doing so. The moment her feet touched the marble of the hall, all 4 flashlights flickered simultaneously, an event that everyone attributed to coincidence, except Lily, who murmured, "They know we're here now." The initial exploration of the mansion occurred as a group, no one admitting they preferred not to separate in that oppressive environment. The living room still contained furniture covered by yellowed sheets, creating ghostly silhouettes in the dimness. The kitchen, with its antique utensils and a huge wood-burning stove, seemed frozen in time. It was in the first-floor library that they experienced the first truly inexplicable event. While examining the shelves filled with leather-bound volumes, some in languages none of them recognized, the temperature dropped drastically in a matter of seconds. "Did anyone else feel that?" asked Mike, his breath suddenly visible in the air. Emily consulted a small digital thermometer she had brought. "Impossible," she murmured, showing the display to the others. "The temperature dropped almost 20 degrees in less than a minute. This defies the laws of thermodynamics." Jason tried to rationalize. "It must be some kind of draft coming from a broken window or something." At that exact moment, all the windows in the library slammed shut simultaneously with force, causing all 4 to jump in fright. "Just the wind," said Jason, his voice betraying his uncertainty. Lily, who had been examining a particularly old book, closed it slowly and looked directly at a dark corner of the room. "It's not the wind," she said calmly. "It's her, Eleanor. She doesn't want us touching his thing." After the incident in the library, the atmosphere among the friends subtly changed. Mike's jokes became more forced, Emily's skepticism more pronounced, as if she constantly needed to reaffirm that there were rational explanations for everything. They decided to establish a base camp in the living room, unrolling their sleeping bags and opening some of the drinks they had brought. "A toast to our courage," proposed Jason, raising a bottle of vodka. "Or to our stupidity," added Mike, accepting a generous swig. Emily refused the drink, preferring to stay alert, while Lily just held her glass, looking at the liquid as if she could see something reflected in it. It was during this attempt at normalcy that they noticed the second disturbing sign. Objects in the room seemed to change position when they weren't looking directly at them. A chair that had been against the wall was now turned toward the center of the room. A pendulum clock that wasn't working began marking the hours, although its pendulum remained motionless. And more disturbingly, the photos in the dusty frames seemed to show different people each time someone looked at them. As the night progressed, the inexplicable events intensified. Almost inaudible whispers emanated from the wall, not distinct words, but a constant murmur that seemed to increase and decrease like a distant conversation. Doors they had left open were found closed, and vice versa. At one point, Mike swore he had seen a small child running down the hallway on the second floor, only to discover that the corridor ended in a solid wall with no visible doors or passages. "This isn't funny, guys," he said, visibly shaken upon returning to the living room. "Which one of you went up before me?" When everyone denied it, Mike visibly paled. "Then who was that child I saw?" Emily, trying to maintain her composure, suggested they check their cell phones to see if they could get a signal, a transparent attempt to seek some connection with the outside world. It was then that they discovered that none of the devices were working anymore, not just without signal, but completely dead, despite having been fully charged before the trip. "This is impossible," murmured Emily, repeatedly trying to turn on her phone. All at the same time, the statistical probability is... She was interrupted by Jason, who had gone to check the front door. "Guys," he called, his voice strangely tense. "I think we have a bigger problem. The door won't open." Panic began to set in when they confirmed that not only the main door, but all doors and windows on the first floor were impossible to open, not locked, but as if they had been sealed to the wall without any gap or movement. Mike tried to break a window with a chair, only to see the object ricochet with surprising force, nearly hitting him. "This doesn't make sense," Emily repeated, examining the door frames with growing desperation. "The wood should be deteriorated after so many years. It should break easily." Jason, trying to maintain calm as the unofficial leader of the group, suggested they go upstairs to check the windows on the upper floors. It was during this discussion that everyone noticed something disturbing. Lily was sitting quietly in a corner, talking in a low voice to someone who wasn't there. When Jason called her name, she turned slowly, her eyes strangely unfocused. "They're awake now," she said, her voice almost unrecognizable. "All of them. And they're hungry. So hungry after waiting for so long." A heavy silence fell over the group as they processed her words, broken only by the distinct sound of childlike footsteps running across the ceiling above them, followed by a laugh that no human child would be capable of producing. The decision to climb to the second floor was made reluctantly, but driven by the growing need to find an exit. Jason led the group, his flashlight illuminating the majestic wooden staircase that creaked under their feet with each step. Emily followed close behind, staying near him, while Mike practically clung to her back. Lily came last, her movements mechanical, as if she were being guided by something beyond her own will. The second floor revealed a long corridor with several closed doors, some adorned with elaborate carvings, others simple and discreet. "Let's check all the windows," Jason instructed, his voice betraying a subtle tremor. "Stay together and don't touch anything that isn't necessary." As they advanced down the corridor, the lights from their flashlights began to weaken simultaneously, as if something were draining their batteries. "This is impossible," Emily murmured, frantically shaking her flashlight. "I put in new batteries before we left." It was at that moment they heard a distinct sound coming from behind one of the doors, a soft melody being played on a piano, though the notes sounded slightly out of tune, as if the instrument hadn't been tuned for decades. The door from which the music came opened by itself as they approached, revealing a children's room preserved in a disturbing state of perfection. Unlike the rest of the house, there was no dust or signs of deterioration. The bed was perfectly made, toys organized on shelves, and a small white grand piano occupied the corner of the room, its keys moving by themselves, playing a lullaby that they all vaguely recognized. "This isn't possible," whispered Emily, her skepticism finally shaken by the evidence before her eyes. Mike took a step back, almost tripping over his own feet. "We need to get out of here, now." But Jason, as if hypnotized, advanced to the center of the room, his eyes fixed on a porcelain doll sitting in a rocking chair that began to move gently when he approached. It was Lily who broke the trance, grabbing his arm with surprising strength. "Don't touch it," she warned, her voice urgent. "It's not what it seems. Nothing here is." At that exact moment, the music stopped abruptly, and all the doors in the corridor slammed simultaneously except the one leading to the room where they were, and the one leading to the stairs to the third floor. The ascent to the third floor was marked by a growing sense of oppression, as if the air itself was becoming denser, making breathing difficult. This floor was notably different from the others, more austere, with fewer doors, and a corridor that ended in a single entrance, ornamented with strange symbols carved into the dark wood. "Charles Blackwood's office," Lily murmured, as if reciting information implanted in her mind. And above it, the attic. Jason tried to open the office door, only to recoil with a muffled cry, holding his hand as if it had been burned. "The doorknob is boiling hot," he exclaimed, showing the palm of his hand where a red mark in the shape of a strange symbol was beginning to form. Emily, her face pale in the weak light of the flashlights, pointed to a narrow staircase at the end of the corridor. The attic might have a skylight or some exit to the roof. No one mentioned the obvious, that they were being deliberately guided upward, deeper and deeper into the house rather than out. Mike, who had remained unusually silent, finally spoke. "Don't you feel it? Something is watching us. Something in every room, behind every door, waiting." The attic of Blackwood Mansion was a vast, cavernous space, with the sloping ceiling following the lines of the roof. Unlike the rest of the house, this environment was in complete disarray. Stacked boxes, broken furniture, and what appeared to be antique scientific equipment scattered across improvised tables. In the center of the attic, a circle had been drawn on the wooden floor, with complex symbols that none of them recognized, except Lily, who began to tremble uncontrollably upon seeing them. "It's here," she whispered. "It's here." That he opened the door. It was Emily who found the diary, hidden inside a broken music box, a small book bound in dark red leather with the name Elizabeth Blackwood engraved on the cover. As Emily leafed through the yellowed pages, her face grew increasingly horrified. "This can't be real," she murmured, passing the diary to Jason. The entries began as the typical diary of a 12-year-old girl, but gradually described how her father, Charles Blackwood, had become obsessed with what he called the science beyond science after the death of his youngest son from tuberculosis. The experiment started small, attempts to communicate communicate with the deceased through seances, but soon evolved into elaborate rituals involving animal sacrifices and eventually the invocation of entities that Elizabeth described as neither alive nor dead, but hungry, always hungry. The final pages of Elizabeth's diary detailed the final ritual, how Charles had managed to open a portal to what he called the void between worlds, allowing these entities to partially enter our reality. According to Elizabeth, the creatures promised Charles the return of his son in exchange for hosts, physical bodies they could inhabit. The final entry, dated the day of the supposed fire, was written in a trembling handwriting and stained with tears. Father has betrayed us. He promised them not just strangers but his own family. Mother has already been taken. Her eyes are no longer hers. Thomas too. I can hear them scratching at my door now. They are not my father or my mother or my older brother. They are them using their skins like costumes. I know I will be next. If anyone finds this, please do not believe what you see or hear in this house. They may look like the people you love. They may sound like them, but they are not. And once they mark you, they will never let you go. It was at that moment they heard Mike scream, who had moved away to examine the other side of the attic. When they turned, he was being dragged into the shadows by something that seemed to have multiple arms. His face contorted in absolute terror as he screamed, "They're inside the walls! They're inside the walls!" Before anyone could react, Mike disappeared into the darkness, his screams echoing for a few seconds before abruptly ceasing, leaving a silence more disturbing than any sound. Mike's disappearance triggered chaos. Jason ran into the darkness where his friend had vanished, only to find a solid wall where seconds before there seemed to be a passage. Emily entered a state close to hysteria, reciting scientific facts like a mantra, as if she could force reality to conform to the laws of physics she knew. Lily, however, seemed strangely calm, her eyes fixed on the ritual circle in the center of the attic. "They're almost complete now," she said, her voice distant. 3 decades waiting for new hosts. Mike was the first. They chose him because his fear was the purest, the most savory. Jason grabbed Lily by the shoulders, shaking her violently. "What are you talking about? We have to find him." Lily looked at him, her eyes suddenly clear and focused. "We can't. The Mike we knew no longer exists, and soon we won't exist either, not as we are now." It was at that moment that the flashlights finally failed completely, plunging the attic into absolute darkness. In the next instant, lights began to emanate from the ritual circle, not the natural illumination of fire or electricity, but a sickly greenish glow that seemed to absorb light rather than emit it. And within that circle, a figure began to materialize, a silhouette that initially seemed human, but whose proportions were subtly wrong, like a distorted painting of a person. When the figure spoke, it used Mike's voice, but with an underlying timbre that made everyone's teeth ache upon hearing it. "Welcome to the true Blackwood Mansion. We've missed you. We've been so alone for so long." Dawn arrived in Ravenwood as always, with the sun slowly rising over the wooded hills that surrounded the small town. For most residents, it was just another ordinary Sunday, some preparing for church, others for a late breakfast after Saturday night. No one immediately noticed the damaged Cherokee Jeep that appeared on the main road, moving at an irregular speed, as if the driver could barely control the vehicle. It was old Pete, sweeping the sidewalk in front of the diner, who first saw the car stop abruptly in the middle of the street, the driver's door opening to reveal Jason Miller, unrecognizable at first glance. The boy who had left town the night before, confident, athletic with the world at his feet, returned as a shadow of himself. His face was marked by deep scratches, his eyes bloodshot and wild, and his body trembled uncontrollably as he tried to exit the vehicle. From the passenger side, Emily emerged in a similar state, her normally impeccable hair tangled with what appeared to be cobwebs and unknown substances, her broken glasses hanging crookedly on her face. In the back seat, Lily Thompson sat perfectly still, staring straight ahead, her face serene in disturbing contrast to the chaos around her. There was no sign of Mike Donovan. The first 48 hours after the teenager's return were marked by confusion and conflicting theories. Sheriff Miller, Jason's father, personally led the search for Mike at Blackwood Mansion, only to find the place completely different from what the young people described. There was no ritual circle in the attic, no Elizabeth Blackwood diary, no sign of struggle or disturbance beyond what would be expected in a house abandoned for decades. The doors and windows opened normally. The piano in the children's room was covered in dust, with several keys missing, and there was absolutely no physical evidence that corroborated the frantic stories told by the survivors. Drugs was the initial conclusion, that the teenagers had consumed some hallucinogenic substance that resulted in a shared experience of terror and in Mike's possible escape or accident. But the toxicology tests came back negative, and the search for Mike Donovan continued unsuccessfully, eventually being reclassified from missing person to case filed pending new evidence. For most Ravenwood residents, the incident became just another chapter in the long history of rumors about Blackwood Mansion, a sad story of reckless teenagers, but nothing supernatural. For Jason, Emily and Lily, however, the return to normalcy proved impossible. Jason, who had been found with a strange symbol-shaped burn on his right palm, developed a paralyzing fear of darkness. The star quarterback, who once led the team in night games under the floodlights, now couldn't stay in a room without all the lights on. His parents installed emergency lighting systems throughout the house after the third episode, in which they found him screaming uncontrollably on the floor during a power outage. His nightmares were so intense that he often woke up with his throat raw from screaming, describing visions of Mike being repeatedly dismembered and reconstructed in impossible ways, begging for help while they used his body like a puppet. The university that had offered him a full athletic scholarship withdrew the offer after Jason had a nervous breakdown during a campus visit when the dormitory lights flickered momentarily. "They're everywhere now," he whispered to the school counselor during one of the mandatory therapy sessions. "They found a way out through us, and they're just getting started." Emily Chen, whose identity had been built around rationality and scientific thinking, suffered perhaps the most profound transformation. The girl who once cited laws of physics and statistical probabilities now filled entire notebooks with symbols similar to those found in the ritual circle, often entering trance-like states while doing so. Her parents, university professors, who initially sought psychological explanations for her behavior, were horrified to discover that she had transformed her room into a replica of the attic of Blackwood Mansion, with equations and diagrams covering all available surfaces. When questioned about her actions, Emily responded with disturbing clarity. "I'm trying to understand the mathematics of the other side. There are patterns, see? Frequencies that allow them to manifest. If I can decode the algorithms, maybe I can close them back." Her admission to Harvard was indefinitely postponed after she tried to explain to a psychiatrist that reality as we know it is just the outermost membrane of a multidimensional structure inhabited by ancient consciousnesses that feed on human emotion. Most disturbing, however, were the times when, during normal conversations, her voice subtly changed, and she made comments using information she couldn't possibly know, intimate details about the people around her, secrets that had never been shared, as if something inside her could see through the layers of privacy that humans build around themselves. Lily Thompson, on the other hand, never spoke again after that night. Not from physical trauma, doctors confirmed that her vocal cords were perfectly functional, but by choice. She communicated exclusively through drawings, producing hundreds of them with disturbing precision, all depicting the same figure, a humanoid being with slightly distorted proportions, always partially hidden in the shadows, always watching. Lily's grandmother, who took over her care, reported other disturbing behaviors, how the girl would often stand for hours in front of mirrors, as if silently conversing with her reflection, how birds and small animals would inexplicably die when they remained too long near her, and how on certain nights she would disappear from her locked room, only to be found at dawn, sitting in the garden, perfectly dry even during storms, looking in the direction of the forest where Blackwood Mansion stood. In the distance, the few who still maintained contact with Lily swore that sometimes, when they thought she wasn't paying attention, they could see something moving under her skin, as if what inhabited her body didn't fit perfectly inside it. The true horror, however, was not limited to the 3 survivors. In the weeks following the incident, Ravenwood began to change in subtle ways. First came the nightmares. nightmares. Almost everyone in town reported vivid dreams involving Blackwood Mansion and distorted figures calling them inside. Then came the disappearances. A mailman who was doing his route near the property. Two teenagers who, inspired by the stories about Jason and his friends, attempted their own nighttime adventure. Dr. Reeves, who had treated the survivors at the hospital and had begun asking questions about the strange marks found on their bodies. The authorities attributed the disappearances to mundane causes, running away, accidents in the forest, unfortunate coincidences, but the local population instinctively knew that something had changed in their town. People began to avoid going out after nightfall. Curtains remained closed even during the day. Conversations ceased when strangers approached, and throughout the town, the shadows seemed deeper, denser, as if something inhabited them, watching and waiting. The local reverend noticed an increase in church attendance, but also a disturbing change in prayer requests, no longer for health or prosperity, but for protection against what waits in the shadows and those who wear borrowed faces. The truth that no one dared speak aloud was that whatever had been confined to Blackwood Mansion for decades was now free, slowly spreading through the town like an infection, person by person, dream by dream, shadow by shadow. 6 months after the incident, Sheriff Miller was called to investigate a disturbance at the Donovan house, where Mike's parents had become increasingly isolated, refusing to accept their son's disappearance. When he arrived, he found the house silent and the doors unlocked. In the couple's bedroom, he discovered them sitting on the bed, staring fixedly at the wall, where they had repeatedly written a single phrase, "He's coming home." In the center of Mike's room, he found a circle identical to the one the teenagers had described in the mansion's attic, drawn with a substance that tests would later confirm to be a mixture of ashes and human blood. That same night, as the sheriff was reporting his findings to his deputies, his son Jason appeared at the police station, his face strangely calm for the first time in months. "They're almost ready now, Dad," he said, his voice overlaid by another deeper and more ancient one. Mike was just the first. Soon everyone in Ravenwood will be perfect hosts. When the sheriff, horrified, reached for his gun, he noticed that the shadows in the corner of the room had become impossibly dense, and within them he could vaguely distinguish multiple pairs of eyes watching, eyes that belonged to no creature of this world. It was then that he understood the terrible truth. What had happened to the children at Blackwood Mansion was not the end of a horror story, but merely the first chapter of something much larger and more ancient, something that had patiently waited for decades for new hosts, and that now, finally, had found an open door to our world. The story of what really happened at Blackwood Mansion on that autumn night remains an official mystery to the outside world. Police reports speak of reckless teenagers, possible use of hallucinogenic substances, and the tragic disappearance of Mike Donovan, attributed to an unspecified accident. The official investigations were closed, the cases filed away, and for those who only read the records, it is just another tragedy involving young people who ventured where they shouldn't have. But for the inhabitants of Ravenwood, the truth is a constant and silent presence that permeates every aspect of their daily lives. No one openly speaks about the changes that have occurred in the town since that night, just as no one mentions the fact that on certain days, when the sky is particularly cloudy and the wind blows from the east, the silhouette of Blackwood Mansion on the hill seems slightly different, as if the very architecture of the building had been subtly altered to reflect something that doesn't entirely belong to this world. The three survivors followed distinct paths, united only by the terrible knowledge they carry. Jason Miller, after multiple admissions to psychiatric institutions, eventually disappeared during a storm that caused a blackout throughout the city. His room found empty, despite the 5 emergency lamps he kept constantly lit. Emily Chen now lives in a tiny apartment in Boston, its walls covered with increasingly complex equations and diagrams, sustained by a research grant from an obscure private foundation interested in her studies on alternative realities, a foundation whose directors never appear in person, communicating only through letters written on yellowed paper with a slightly sulfuric odor. As for Lily Thompson, she officially resides with her grandmother on the outskirts of town, although neighbors report that the elderly woman often spends days alone, insisting that her granddaughter is visiting old friends at the mansion. A particularly disturbing claim considering that no one ever sees Lily leave or return to the house. What few know, except those who have already been touched by what inhabits Blackwood Mansion, is that the barrier between our world and the other side, as Emily calls it in her increasingly incoherent writings, continues to weaken. Each nightmare shared by the residents of Ravenwood, each shadow that moves unnaturally when observed from the corner of the eye, each whisper heard in empty rooms, are small fissures in reality, allowing something ancient and hungry to gradually infiltrate our world. Elizabeth Blackwood's diary was never officially found, but excerpts from it began to mysteriously appear on obscure internet forums, posted by users whose accounts exist for only a few hours before disappearing. These fragments speak of entities that exist in the spaces between realities, beings that feed on human emotions, particularly fear, and that once they find a gateway, never completely abandon it. Perhaps the most disturbing aspect of this entire story is the way it continues to spread, like a silent contagion. Visitors to Ravenwood return to their cities with recurring nightmares about a Victorian mansion and distorted figures that call them by name. People who read about the incident online report peripheral visions of shadows that shouldn't be there, and those who hear the complete story, the true details of what happened to Jason, Emily, Lily, and Mike, often discover that they can no longer feel completely comfortable in darkness, always feeling that there is something watching, patiently waiting on the other side of a door that has been opened just a crack, but that can never be completely closed again. For this is the true nature of the horror that was released. It is not just about a haunted house or vengeful ghosts, but an ancient and patient hunger that, having briefly tasted our world through those 4 teenagers, now tirelessly seeks more doors to open, more minds to inhabit, more fears to savor. And so Blackwood Mansion remains at the top of the hill, seemingly abandoned, its dark windows like eyes watching the town below. Local residents swear that on certain nights they can see lights moving inside it, although no one has the courage to investigate. Occasionally, someone reports having seen 4 teenage figures walking along the road leading to the property, only to disappear into the mist before they can be identified. And on particularly quiet nights, when the wind blows in the right direction, some swear they can hear the distant sound of an out-of-tune piano playing a lullaby, accompanied by the laughter of children that doesn't sound entirely human. For what happened to the children at Blackwood Mansion was not an ending, but a beginning, the first chapter of a horror story that continues to be written page by page, nightmare by nightmare, shadow by shadow, spreading slowly like dark ink in clear water, transforming everything it touches into something almost but not quite as it was before.